I find a lot of people do start to switch the focus too much to energy. Then what happens is that they neglect the hydration, and that's what actually sets them up for a downfall.
You know, you can be hydrated, but your cells might not be fully saturated.
Water on its own with high fluid loss becomes very limited in how it gets absorbed in the human body. If you think about the gut, you know, water goes in, it's like a blocked drain in a way. It will empty at a specific rate. But as that fluid loss becomes a lot more excessive, you definitely need to start increasing your sodium intake. And not only taking sodium with it, you need to take a little bit of carbs in order to activate both SGLT1 and obviously the GLUT2 transporters to maximize that fluid absorption.
So we are fast approaching the 99th Comrades Marathon on the 14th of June. 21,633 runners have qualified for the up run this year from Durban to Pietermaritzburg, possibly the biggest field in history. So runners are putting the final touches to their training and hopefully have fine-tuned their nutrition strategies. But one thing they may not have thought about is the important role that proper hydration plays, not only in their ability to apply their training and support their fueling, but also to get them to the finish line in their goal time. So I'm joined today by Mark Wolff, co-founder of 32GI, the official nutrition partner of the Comrades Marathon. We're going to talk a bit about optimal hydration. Hi, Mark. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Pedro. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's exciting times. So just to give everybody a bit of background, I mean, you wear many hats. Other than your role at 32GI, you're a certified nutritionist, sports nutrition expert. You're also a coach and an athlete. So give us a bit of background on your involvement in the industry.
Yeah, and a blood chemistry expert.
There we go. Like I say, many hats.
Yeah. So look, I think my focus has always been preventative health in athletes. And when I say that, I mean trying to extend or prolong the life of an athlete. And really that does boil down to proper nutrition, obviously proper recovery, obviously also proper physiological stress. You know, runners can overrun and they can neglect strength. And one of the biggest focus is obviously also ensuring that fueling is on track, especially during training, as well as, for racing and proper race prep. And obviously when we talk about fueling, we're not talking about just energy intake. We're obviously talking about hydration as well. I find a lot of people do start to switch the focus too much to energy. And then what happens is that they neglect the hydration, and that's what actually sets them up for a downfall. So we always want to get runners to the finish line with a smile on their face, and that's really the idea.
If you could do that at Comrades, you've done a good job. It is truly a test of endurance, but it's an important point you make, I think, and it's why we're talking about it today. Runners are predominantly focused on the nutrition, especially with all these new technologies, gel technologies, and people trying to get 100 grams of carbs in an hour because that's what the elites do, and that can often complicate an already challenging situation in a run especially on a run like Comrades. Not only is it 85 kilometers this year, but it takes place in really hot and humid conditions. So tell us a bit about the importance of hydration and hydration status, because it exists on a spectrum, and the role that electrolytes play in that, just from a baseline level.
So I think, first of all, your hydration strategy to a big event like that actually starts way before the race. During training, you need to be able to try and test your hydration strategies properly. And a lot of athletes just rely on water en route or isotonic sports drinks, etc., which are fine from an energy perspective. But when it comes to an ultra distance event, your fluid loss is excessive. And like you mentioned, starting in Durban and running to Pietermaritzburg, you're probably going to start in warmer temperatures as well early in the morning. Pietermaritzburg's slightly different on the down run. So your sweat loss would be probably a little bit lower early on. But if you're starting in Durban, your sweat loss rate can actually be climbing quite early on in the race. And that can make quite a difference. So the first thing that I say to runners is, you shouldn't just be getting up in the early hours of the morning and training. You need to actually train in various temperatures. And that means also sometimes doing double sessions. So you might want to run at lunchtime, you might want to run in the afternoon when it's a lot hotter. You need to try and assess your sweat loss, because Comrades is not just a morning run. It's a run that goes through the course of the day. And so you would need to experience what that sweat loss rate would be. it can be a little bit of a guessing game. I know there are people that do sweat tests in laboratories, but I find them very limited because they're not real world scenarios, and it's very different when you're outdoors.
Yep.
When it comes to race prep, I think it's, I just say to people very simply, weigh yourself before training session and after. You can actually assess your fluid loss, and you can actually see how much fluid you should be taking in. At least you want to try and replenish around 80% or more if possible. You're never going to be able to replenish 100% of the fluid that's been lost. But water on its own with high fluid loss becomes very limited in how it gets absorbed in the human body. And that is one of probably the biggest mistake that athletes make, is relying on water for hydration.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that the water that you get en route is, might be treated water. So there might not be the electrolytes that your body needs to actually absorb that liquid. And I think that's the main thing. I think a lot of runners know that they need to take electrolytes before the race, and they do that. But starting in an optimal hydration state doesn't last for the full duration of an ultra like Comrades. So, explain the role of electrolytes and what they do in terms of, maintaining that fluid balance within your body and specifically within your muscle cells.
So when it comes down to the various minerals that we're looking at, sodium is obviously the most important. A lot of people actually say to me, what about potassium? What about calcium? What about magnesium? Sodium is the most vital. And the reason being is that that actually is probably the primary transporter of fluid absorption in the human body. Water goes into the gut, and then it needs to permeate the cell wall and get pulled into the blood. So the only way for that to happen is for something to be able to allow that cell wall to be able to be permeated. And when that happens, sodium does play a very vital role. And if you think about the gut, water goes in, it's like a blocked drain in a way. It sits there, and it will empty at a specific rate. Throw sodium in there, it's like adding a little bit of drain cleaner. It will drop out at a much faster rate. Throw sodium and a little bit of carbohydrates in there, it will rapidly exit the gut. And that's what we call the sodium glucose transporter, so SGLT1 and GLUT2. And that actually rapidly allows for fluid pull through.
Okay, and so we're talking here about multiple things. So it's important to start the race in a hydrated state. As I mentioned earlier, hydration exists on a spectrum. The concept of euhydration might be foreign to a lot of runners. You can be hydrated, but your cells might not be fully saturated. But that balance can quickly shift because of what you said. You're taking in too much water, so you're diluting the salts, and then you're also starting to add carbohydrates to the mix, which require, as you mentioned, water to be pulled in from the gut and then into the muscle cells.
Correct.
Okay, so what are a few options that runners have to support their electrolyte balance during a race?
Well, let's start before the race. I think mineral loading pre the race is a very good idea. So I would say 72 hours, 3 days out, I would start increasing sodium intake significantly. And that could be 2 to 3 bottles of an electrolyte solution through the day, something that's quite concentrated with sodium, to just try and up those sodium levels. Because if fluid loss is great and you actually are taking on water, you want to make sure at least there's a balance between sodium and fluid in the body. So that's the first thing. And we've seen that mineral loading actually does make a significant difference. For those people that have tried it, the feedback's been phenomenal. And there are a lot of other companies out there that actually advocate it as well. When it comes down to the actual race, again, hydration starts even before the start. You definitely need to get up in the morning, start pre-hydrating before the start. Obviously, you don't want to overload the bladder because we know what that's like. Getting to Comrades start, being stuck there, and then suddenly you need the toilet. So obviously, everybody's unique individual, and that just needs to be taken into account. Through the race, prevention is always better than cure. So make sure that you are hydrating, I would say frequently, not excessively, but through frequent periods through the race. And generally, I like to use clock feeds for energy intake, and I like to separate hydration from energy. So when it comes to energy intake, we know that you've got a certain volume of carbohydrates that you want to consume on an hourly basis, and you need to split that maybe into, I would say, 30-minute feeds. But then you can split your hydration in between that. So you could look at hydration being 15 minutes, 45 minutes, and using the 30 and the 60 minutes as your energy feeds. So just separating them out and then, putting a focus on hydration as well. It sounds complicated, but it's not really, because if you clock feed and you know what you're doing from a hydration and an energy perspective, you'll actually get it right. You'll nail it. When it comes to your hydration strategy, it's very important to understand that fluid intake is obviously going to be based on sort of fluid loss. And if you've trained and you've understood what your fluid loss will be, you would have a much better understanding of the kind of uptake that you need. But most athletes don't. And the idea is that if you think you're going to drink a carbohydrate drink or a gel and you're going to take in water, that's going to hydrate you, it's going to not hydrate you to the extent that you might want to be hydrated. In the beginning, it probably will, because you're creating an isotonic environment where you're actually getting energy and you're getting fluid pull through. But as that fluid loss becomes a lot more excessive, you definitely need to start increasing your sodium intake. And not only taking sodium with it, you need to take a little bit of carbs in order to activate both SGLT1 and obviously the GLUT2 transporters to maximize that fluid absorption. So taking in a little bit of carb with salt and taking in the fluid with it is the most important thing. Now, when it comes to running, you're very limited with what you can carry. And so a lot of people do rely with what's en route. When it comes to water, there's plenty of water on Comrades route. Some of the water en route is not pure water. Some of it is probably isotonic drink. We know Thirsty, one of the official partners of Comrades Marathon, is providing all of this en route. So taking a hypertonic drink is isotonic drink is going to pull through energy, and it's going to mildly hydrate you, but it's not going to hydrate you to the extent that you need to be hydrated. In order for that to happen, absolutely need to increase that sodium intake as well, and that needs to be at different junctions on the route.
Okay, and so, I mean, what are some of the options that runners then have? Particularly, so I want to bring up the energy point here. So you mentioned breaking up your feeds a little regular and often. I mean, there's a lot of runners who are getting caught up in this 100 grams an hour, carbohydrate. I don't want to call it a craze. I mean, it does work for high intensity efforts like marathons, but it's not necessarily what you need on a lower intensity, longer duration event like Comrades. So if you are trying to take in, like, say, a large bolus of carbs and maybe a bit of protein, that's obviously also going to upset the balance. So, how can you effectively get the salts if you're only taking water and you don't necessarily have seconds along the course like the pros do at every water table to get some solution in?
So it's very important to understand that when you are taking energy in like that, whether it's in the form of gels or whatever carbohydrates you are taking, whether it's bananas, potatoes, whatever the format, and you're drinking water, where the focus there is on energy pull through.
Yeah.
It's really trying to get those carbs to the working muscles. And if you don't pull in enough fluid, if you don't take in enough fluid when you're consuming those carbohydrates, you can actually land up in a dehydrated process, because the fluid in the body is going to be pulled back into the gut to help process the carbohydrates that need to be then, pushed back out. So that can be a dangerous situation. That's why you need to separate them out. So when it comes to the hydration part of things, simple things like salt tablets can make a massive difference. I mean, if you're looking at the basics, taking in salt and I would say you don't need a lot of carbohydrates with it to activate that co-transporter mechanism. A small amount's enough, but to have some salt, a little bit of carbs, and then to drink fluid with it would help pull it through. There's a lot of electrolyte products out there. I mean, in the 32 GR range, for example, we've got Cramper Salt, which is a electrolyte gel. It is a co-transporter because it's got some glucose in and it's got sodium in. And then the other option is obviously taking in. A lot of people have got effervescence, but I find that it's just too time-consuming to drop an effervescent in a bottle and wait. So sachets of powder are a lot more convenient. And I mean, there are brands out there. We've got a Hydrate 1000, which is 1,000 milligrams sodium. Again, a little bit of carbs in there to activate the co-transporter mechanism.
Okay, and you've touched on it seems like the magic number these days. A lot of athletes are focused on this 1,000 milligrams an hour of sodium. Can you give us a bit of background as to why this number's come about, and why the focus has been on recently been on higher sodium intakes for specific athletes?
I don't think it's 1,000 milligrams for every athlete. And that's something, it's a very important point that you bring up. I think from a health perspective, you've got to be very careful of 1,000 milligrams per an hour. If you look at just World Dietary Guidelines, from a health perspective, the cutoff is 2,300 milligrams per day.
Yeah.
And so if somebody's on daily hydrating and they're taking 1,000 milligrams of sodium on a daily basis, I think they're overdoing it. And that can increase blood pressure, can put a stress on the cardiovascular system. It's not something that you would want to happen. So hydration needs to be unique to an individual's needs. So if we're talking about on an average training day, most sweat rates are low to moderate, unless they're doing much longer or more intense sessions. When it comes to racing, obviously it's a different story because the effort is obviously a lot higher. So from an intensity perspective, it is higher. Comrades obviously is not very high intensity. Like you mentioned earlier, it's an ultra. And so you can get away with a little bit lower zone efforts as opposed to pushing yourself too hard. And then that sweat loss needs to be managed according to, what your unique requirements are. For some athletes, it might be 500 milligrams. For some, it's 750. For some people, 1,000 milligrams. I know athletes that are up to 1,500 milligrams. There's a German athlete that I've known for many, many years, 1,500 milligrams, less than that, they suffer. So I think it really boils down to what works for an actual individual. But I don't think you're going to go very wrong between 750 to 1,000 milligrams of sodium per an hour, as long as you're obviously taking in the right amount of fluid with that.
Okay, and that's during the race, again, like you specified.
Yes.
Something you do every day, because high sodium intakes, as you mentioned, is associated with certain health risks. So what are a few things that runners can look out for, warning signs, if they are taking perhaps too much sodium? I know for one, puffiness, a bit of swelling, generally accompanies excess sodium intake.
Well, it increases blood pressure. So you could have a little bit of a hard beating heart, a bit of an elevated heart rate. You could also have red eyes. There's a lot of things that are symptomatic of sort of blood pressure changes. And for some people, they might not actually feel it. It could be silently damaging them in the background. Until some such time as they go for a medical or something happens, and that's not something that you would really want. There's a lot of hype on social media where experts say water is not sufficient enough to hydrate. It's absolute nonsense. Water is very sufficient for hydration. Human beings were, we were born to consume water to be able to hydrate. The amount of sodium that you take in can be very low to nominal on a daily basis, especially because your dietary intake is going to have sodium in there as well. And nobody goes and measures sodium. I've measured sodium intake on a daily basis. And without taking a hydration solution, just my food intake could land me up. I mean, dietary guidelines look about 2.3 grams a day. I can sometimes land up with 6 to 7 grams a day, just based on natural food intake. Obviously, the more you train, the more you eat, to make sure that you are sort of maintaining that sort of caloric balance. You don't want to end up in a low energy availability sort of issue. So water does hydrate, but as we start to do exercise, the longer the session, the more intense the session, the more the fluid loss, you can start to build up your sodium intake to be able to balance sort of that fluid loss and to remain hydrated. And I think it's a bit of playing around and tweaking to see what works best for an individual. But when it comes to racing, like we mentioned, it is a different story. When it comes to long training sessions, and also climate plays a very vital role. Humidity, temperature, the surface area of a person's body, the larger the surface area, the bigger they are, the heavier they are, the more areas there are for fluid loss. So they are going to lose a lot more fluid. And so I like to ask athletes a question, are you, I mean, we can talk about this a little bit later, but have you suffered from cramps before, or do you suffer from cramps? Because it can boil back down to hydration. Are you a heavy sweater? Some people say to me, my clothes are loaded with salt, then you know that they're heavy sweaters. Do you actually take in a large amount of salt on a daily basis in your actual diet? Do you put salt on your food all the time? you'll find that high salt eaters are high salt excretors. And so their dietary requirements from a sodium point of view are impacting or influencing their hydration requirements in the long run.
Okay, and genetics also plays a role, which is obviously something that
Absolutely
you need testing. So all of these factors combined obviously would inform your sodium needs on the race. Okay, well, I mean, you alluded to some of the things that can go wrong when you get when your electrolyte balance in general and sodium specifically, aren't aligned, or you're not maintaining the appropriate levels. So you've mentioned cramps. That's I've experienced it myself. You can get full body cramps. I mean, I've cramped in my neck and my arms, and so I mean that is a normal sign that the electrical activity in your body is not working well, because it needs electrolytes for your muscles to fire properly. What are a couple of the other symptoms that you could experience when you get this balance wrong?
Well, I think it's important that you mentioned this. You're not cramping in one very focused specific area. Your cramping is a little bit more broad, and that generally boils down to a mineral issue. You've also got to look at the opposite side. We spoke about hyponatremia earlier.
Yes.
And that's something that's very, very important, because dehydration you can recover from. Overhydration is a lot more difficult.
Yeah.
And very often a medic can get it wrong.
Yes.
So you need to understand that you need to prevent that from happening. Well, how does that happen? It happens quite simply, like you mentioned earlier. You drink fluid, it dilutes your sodium levels, and it creates swelling now in the body. It starts to swell. But you will feel something happening in your gut. You'll feel the sloshing effect, and we call that the washing machine effect. You'll feel that the fluid is not exiting the system. And the minute that happens, you need to stop drinking immediately. You need to take on salt, and you need to take on some carbs, and you need to allow that fluid to be pulled through. But you cannot carry on drinking. Once it's exited your stomach and you're not feeling that sloshing around anymore, you can start taking on fluid again. And that's very important to address, early on, because at Comrades specifically, or any ultra event, I've seen what happens when people get very hot. It's similar symptoms to dehydration. Overhydration and dehydration have got very similar symptoms, and people aren't knowledgeable enough to identify what's going on. So the sloshing effect is definitely one way to identify it. But also, when you're going to cool yourself off because you're hot and bothered, throw the water on the outside. Don't they like to get it in the mouth. They want to feel it coming down. They feel like it's going to cool them. Throw the cold or the ice water over the body, throw it on the core area, throw it on the back. Cool yourself from the outside. You don't need to overconsume and cool yourself from the inside. It's another mistake that a lot of athletes make during an ultra.
Yeah, I found it beneficial to actually swirl, even if it's a carbohydrate drink or a cold water sachet, and then actually spit it out, just to get that psychological effect, and then cooling yourself. If it is something that you're trying to do, obviously hydration, you drink to hydrate, douse to cool. No, I think it's an important point, and I think the issue of hyponatremia, obviously brought to the forefront by Professor Tim Noakes quite a few years ago in his book Waterlogged.
Yes.
I do find that it's kind of, a lot of people think of it as overhydration, drinking too much, and that's not necessarily the case. We've spoken about sodium, and what can actually happen is you get that sodium balance completely wrong, and you can still become hyponatremic.
Correct.
Because water's moving in the wrong direction. So again, as somebody who's tried to drink sufficient water and thought that I'm over drinking, it turns out that a lot of my issues were particularly just sodium related. So I think it's important, especially with the water points. I think it's every 3 kilometers, or it is easy to get caught up and take 4 or 5 sachets in at a time and drink too much. But sometimes hyponatremia is also about not getting enough electrolytes.
I actually, when Bongamusa and Tembu won Comrades downrun, I can't remember the exact year. It was many years ago, and could have been 2014 maybe. No, I'm not sure. But we were seconding him en route, and I think between in the last 20 kilometers, 25, I think he took on something like 30 or 35 water sachets. And I think only 2 or 3 went down his mouth.
Yeah.
The rest went over his body. And it was really good. He was just cooling himself down, keeping the heart rate low so he could carry on pushing himself. But he wasn't overhydrating. He was hydrating very, very smartly.
Yeah, your body cools down with your skin, and the effect that sweating or water has on with the wind. I think that's what people get wrong. They try and cool from the inside.
Yeah.
So, okay. So you've mentioned feeding to a plan and drinking to a plan. How much water roughly or fluids do you recommend for that athletes look to take every hour over a race like Comrades?
I think if you look at the science there, it definitely does depend on the size of an individual for sure, and how much fluid loss is going to take place. There's actually there's some nice algorithms that you can play with on the internet, and I've been playing with AI quite a lot lately to try and run these calculations. But I would say early on when it's cooler, you could probably get away with 400 to 600 mils per an hour, depending on the individual. But as the temperatures start to climb and fluid loss starts to climb, I mean, you could be going up to anywhere between 750 to 1,000 milliliters on an hourly basis. There's no ways if you took in 1,000 or even 800 milliliters of water on its own that's going to get pulled through your system. That will not be absorbed. That's not going to hydrate you. You need quite a significant amount of sodium and some carbs to be able to pull that through.
Okay, and then you've mentioned isotonic drinks a few times in this discussion.
Yeah.
Perhaps it's worth unpacking what the different types of carbohydrate drinks that runners have available to them, because that can affect, obviously, like you mentioned, the load on their gut and how well it hydrates.
So, yeah, I think in that case, let's look at a gel, for example, is what we call a hypertonic solution. So it's HYPER for those that don't hear it clearly. And that's what we call a concentrated energy solution. In other words, there's very little fluid and it's mainly energy related. A lot of people, when they speak about cramping or stomach cramping or gut issues, etc., it's because they've taken in a hypertonic solution, but they haven't taken in a sufficient amount of fluid to allow for that pull through. And so you actually need to create an environment within the gut that is going to allow that energy to permeate the cell wall and then get pulled into, transported from a glucose perspective and then transported to the muscle. So a lot of people will take on something, a thick, a very viscous gel, for example. You'd probably need to take in about 300 mils of water with it in order to be able to get that proper pull through. And if you leave it too long, you're going to suffer, because now what's going to happen is it's going to sit in the gut, it's going to ferment, it's going to build up a little bit of gas, and you're going to start to get some gastrointestinal distress.
Okay. And every carbohydrate molecule needs a certain number of water molecules to be able to go
exactly.
to the gut. Yeah.
Yes.
So if you're not ingesting water, it's pulling water from the gut, which can also cause that distress.
And it can lead to dehydration, because the water that you need to be cooling your system is now being pulled into the digestive system to try and process that concentrated carbohydrate that you've actually consumed. An isotonic solution is a little bit more balanced. There you're getting fluid and energy pull through, but obviously it's limited in the amount of energy that's going through. So if somebody's relying only on an isotonic drink for energy, they're not going to have enough caloric intake to be able to support their level of effort in a race. You need over and above that. So there are people that will then take isotonic drinks en route, which is fine, because you are allowing for fluid pull through, which is quite good. A little bit more fluid pull through than you would have with water on its own. You are allowing for a little bit of energy pull through. But if you are sweating a lot more, how are you going to increase that fluid intake? You can't rely on an isotonic drink. And if you need more energy, and you're adding gels onto that, then you need to try and find that balance and that combination. Okay. And then lastly, we've got obviously hypertonic, which is very low concentrated. It's not used for energy. That's where hydration solutions come in. Hydration solutions should be hypertonic in nature, in actual fact.
Okay, and I think one last factor that runners need to keep in mind is that the deeper they get into the race, the more their blood is pooling in the legs, and it's your cardiovascular system's taking a lot of strain, and your gut needs blood to actually be able to digest these things. So I know that we've spoken a lot about how you need to structure your nutrition plan. You can start with the heavier bars and whole foods, but later in the race you might need to rely on gels and liquid. Do you want to talk a little bit about that kind of strategy and how you ease the gut distress later into the race, taking all these factors into account?
It's a very good question, in actual fact. So what you mentioned is what we call cardiac drift, obviously. So even if you think you're going to be running in zone 2, just naturally with fluid loss and obviously with intense muscle use over an extended period of time, your heart rate is going to start to elevate. And as it starts to elevate, like you said, it does put stress on the digestive system because, you're pulling blood away from it and you're diverting it to all the working muscles. In that case, what we find that late on in the race is that actually hydration and liquid feeds become a lot more important, actually more important than energy intake. Hydration becomes way more important as the race gets longer. And a lot of people find it very difficult to keep taking on sort of heavy carbohydrates as they're going through a race. And so I always say to people, the way you set up the beginning of the race, feeding consistently and trying to feed as much as you can through the race will obviously set you up a lot better later. Sometimes with endurance events, we find that there is, like you mentioned, 100 grams of carbs per hour. I don't think it's easy to maintain that in an ultra distance event. And also, Comrades is not, maybe for the elites, because they're running at a crazy pace and they are running with severely elevated heart rates for 5.5 hours. And I've seen with them that they can maintain a consistent amount of carbohydrate intake. I don't know anybody that's really gone up to that 120 gram mark. I find a lot of the athletes that I've worked with over the years sit between, I would say, 80 to 100 grams of carbs on an hourly basis. Whether the 120 grams is going to make a huge difference from a performance perspective is quite debatable, because what we really see is that you shouldn't be focused on just that fractional performance perspective. What you need to focus on is gastrointestinal comfort, and that's what lets people down as well. So as the race gets longer, you might start to drop your carbohydrate volume slightly over time to allow for that GI comfort. But at the same time, you are going to have to take on a little bit more fluid, because fluid loss is going to be a lot higher. Temperatures are going to be a lot higher at that time of the day. And so the hydration actually starts to move to the forefront as where your focus should actually be. And you might, another thing that I would advise people is to actually split the feeds even a little bit more. So if you were feeding every 30 minutes, maybe now feed a smaller amount every 15 or 20 minutes, smaller amounts more easily processed by the gut and not putting excessive stress on it.
100%. And, that drip feeding approach works for a lot of people, and it's sensible at that time. So if we can break it down then in terms of we've spoken of throwing some numbers around 120, 100 for the average, runner who's looking at a 9-hour plus time. What type of carbohydrate intakes should they realistically be considering on a per hour basis?
Well, you might get some people running bull runs at fairly low heart rates because they really are very well aerobically conditioned. They've got excellent cardiorespiratory fitness. And then you're going to get some that are actually going to have to push themselves there.
Yeah.
So I think in the end, heart rate data is a true reflection of intensity. And I think that's what you have to manage. You've got to stay under threshold. Absolutely. Because otherwise you're going to burn. And the minimum amount of carbs you should be consuming in an event like this, across the board, I'd say the minimum 60 grams per hour.
Okay.
If you can tolerate more because you've trained your gut to tolerate more, 70, 80, whatever, that's great. If you have not trained your gut to be able to take on a high volume of carbohydrate intake, then at least try and get to that 60 grams per hour.
Okay, and we've spoken a lot about carbohydrates and obviously the electrolytes, but I know that you're also a big proponent of protein on the route, and I think there's a lot of science backing up the role that amino acids and protein can have in sparing or reducing the fatigue that muscles experience, during an endurance event like that. You want to talk a little bit about how the body uses protein and how adding protein into this whole dynamic can, affect your energy intake and your nutritional approach.
Okay, so from a physiological perspective, we've got 3 fuel tanks, not just 2. So we've got glycogen, we've got fat, and we've got a fuel tank that we don't want to use, which is called protein. The protein fuel tank isn't really used by the human body in sort of short duration exercises or events. But once you start going many hours, the brain, the central governor, the brain controls everything in the body. It triggers a process called gluconeogenesis, where it actually takes protein and it converts it into glucose to utilize as a fuel source. And so that is protein going through that process to be used as fuel. You don't want that to happen because it actually is going to utilize muscle protein in order to be able to do that. And the body's just looking for equilibrium. So glycogen's going down, fat's going down. Oh, let's drop some protein as well. Let's try and create a bit of balance in the body. It's not a desirable thing to happen. So that's one thing that I don't think has been researched enough, to be quite honest. The data is still quite thin in it. But we do see that it makes a huge difference when it comes to long endurance events. And it doesn't have to be a large amount of protein. We're talking small amounts. We're talking like maybe 5 to 7 grams of protein in an hour, which is a very, very small amount. It will be converted into a fuel source. So if somebody says, I'm worried about taking on protein, it's going to sit in the gut, it's not a bad thing. It will ultimately be converted into fuel source. It might take a bit longer, but it's not like you're going at a massive intensity. You're not running a 2-hour marathon. The other thing that I found with ultra endurance events that the protein does do is it tends to take away the hunger. It satiates. Obviously, because protein takes a little bit longer than carbohydrate, depending what protein source you are going with. But protein can be intermediate or slower digesting, and it can create a bit of satiety. So what happens is that you'll find that the person feels a little bit more stable. And then along with taking sugar all the time and adding protein to the mix, you don't get this sort of sugar in absorption, sugar drop. You get a little bit of a slowdown and you get a bit more of a stable release. You get a little bit more balance with protein at play. And I find for most people, a little bit of protein works extremely well with carbohydrate intake. We've seen with elite athletes that I've been working with since 2010, let's say. I mean, over the last 16 years, I've worked with a lot of elite runners en route. I've personally fed them protein, carbohydrate protein mixes over and over again. And it's quite interesting. Year after year after year, they came back saying, that's what they're looking for. That's what they want. So it works very well for them. I just found in the beginning the protein intake was a little bit too high with the carbohydrates, the protein to carbohydrate ratio, let's call it. And as time went on, so we reduced protein intake to a much smaller amount, kept the carbohydrates the focus, and that worked very, very well.
Okay, so basically what's happening is your body's breaking down the protein into the amino acids, and those are circulating around your body, and then your body's actually going to metabolize those for the protein-derived energy that you've spoken about. So it has that muscle sparing effect as well as a bit of an energy contribution.
Yeah, so because there's protein in the blood, in the form of amino acids, the body says, I'll leave the muscles alone, I'll focus on that.
Okay, and then so it reduces the extent of the muscle damage, because everyone's going to experience a degree of muscle damage on a long, grueling race like Comrades.
Everyone's going to experience muscle damage.
Yeah.
You just don't want muscle damage to come from something else other than impact.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, so we've thrown a lot of things at runners, quite close to Comrades. So we're not trying to scare them. We're trying to help them, have the best day they can on the route. So I think maybe just to wrap up this conversation is to talk about what can and should runners do right now with 3-4 weeks left before Comrades to fine tune their hydration strategy. The big long runs are done, so they can't really test it on that. But how should runners be incorporating what we've spoken about today into their final preparations before race day?
Well, there's still a little bit of time for some longish runs, let's say. I like to use split runs as a nice measurement, so back to back. So, let's say for example, this weekend, this runner's doing 2.5-hour runs in the morning and maybe a 45-minute to an hour run in the afternoon. What's nice is you can actually get a feel for your kind of fluid loss over, even in an hour, you can get an idea for what your fluid loss would be, under certain temperatures, under warmer conditions. And so you still got, even over 2 or 2.5 hours, you've got the ability to still try and take on a little bit more sodium if you haven't been during your runs. If you have only been taking on water, incorporate a hydration solution rather. Don't drink water on its own. Absolutely go for an electrolyte solution. See how you feel after that session. If you're feeling a lot more stable, a lot stronger, that's great. how do you know if you've nailed the session? It's quite simple. You finish the session and you're feeling stability, you're feeling strong, you're feeling good. A lot of people are feeling absolute fatigue. They want to go lie down, they want to fall asleep, etc. That might not just be a lack of energy intake. It could also be a lack of proper hydration that could be causing those effects. So I think over the next 2 weeks, there's still some time to play a little bit, because there are, like I'd say, there's not long runs, but there are some longish sort of runs that you can still incorporate that in. Bed down your energy intake as well. Try and work on clock feeding. If you are doing a 2-hour run still, or I know some people that are still doing 3-hour runs this weekend. If you are doing these long runs, take a pre-training meal and then start clock feeding maybe 20, 30 minutes into that session, and, hydrate, feed, hydrate, feed, hydrate, feed, and make sure that what you're doing works for you. That you feel comfortable afterwards. And if you do find that you're feeling a lot better, whatever, bed it down, bed it down and take it to race day with you. Don't make any changes on race day, though. Don't go and panic and make any changes. That's the biggest mistake that runners make. Try now and get as much information as possible about what's going to work for you on race day. And the most important bit of advice I can give is keep it simple. A lot of people go and create these soups, which is absolutely crazy. I mean, you wouldn't eat that in normal life, but they'll do it during an ultra endurance event. It's madness.
Yeah. Okay. And I think, having said that, I think one of the most important things that I'm taking away from this discussion with you is to know what to do if things do go wrong. If you do start feeling that sloshing effect, I know from previous experience, I distinguished dehydration from hyponatremia. You kind of get a bit fuzzy. I lose a lot of power. I really struggle to just keep moving. In which case, stop the water intake for a while and make sure that you've got a salt solution or something with you that you can try and normalize again. And then once you're normalized, keep going and get back on track with your plan.
100%.
All right.
It makes a huge difference. A lot of people say to me, biltong is the best form of food on Comrades Route. It gives me on Comrades Route, it gives me so much energy. I'm like, it didn't give you any energy. It gave you salt.
Yeah.
And that's all you needed.
Yeah, exactly. So that's an important point. And then I think also, just keep an eye on the conditions and is it going to be a colder day, a warmer day? You've mentioned about when you should start, taking in sodium. And that's really early on. A lot of people wait, until the sun rises and it starts getting warmer. By then you're already behind. Correct. So I think start early and often is also an important message that you've shared today that runners need to keep in mind.
Yeah. So the human body's got, like we call it, you can call them water warehouses. You prehydrated, but that water warehouse has to have sodium, has to have fluid, and that's why you have to be completely hydrated at the start. If you're 100% hydrated at the start, and you've mineral loaded, you are starting on the right foot. But if you haven't focused on that, and you let's say you're 90% hydrated, you already got a 10%, you're 10% off on the back foot, and it is going to absolutely set you up for failure, because you cannot fix what's already broken. It's broken. It's gonna land you up in trouble. Yeah.
No, 100%. Okay, Mark, I mean, everything you shared today is extremely important and beneficial. So as the official nutrition partner for Comrades, where can runners who potentially have more questions, get in touch with you? I know you're going to be at the expo like you always are. Just give everybody some info on where they can send you more questions or get some more information.
So, I mean, first of all, you can follow us on Instagram and social media at 32GR. If people want to follow me, they're more than welcome to as well, at Wolff Mark. But most people email either the info at 32gr.com or coach at 32gr.com. We try and answer as many questions as possible, but we're getting flooded lately. But I'll do my best. I will be at Expo. We'll have myself and the whole team there answering questions. We are doing a webinar, a Comrades webinar, I think on the 2nd of June, but people must just stay tuned. We'll put it out there. It's just a sort of a last webinar, what to do, the couple of weeks leading into Comrades, and how to get to race day in the best possible shape from a nutrition perspective.
Great. Well, thank you very much for coming in today, Mark.
Thanks, Peter.
What you shared is invaluable, and I hope it really helps Comrades runners achieve their goal in the day.
I hope so too. And yeah, wishing you all a good Comrades event, and yeah, to the finish line with a smile. That's the idea.
Yeah, let's hope so.